It is 6:14 in the morning, and you are standing in your shower, waiting. Waiting for the cold water to clear the pipe. Waiting for the tank in your basement to catch up with what you're asking of it. 30 seconds. 45 seconds. You are losing money standing there and you don't even know it, because that tank downstairs is doing the same thing it does every single day of the year. Burning gas or pulling electricity around the clock to keep 200 pounds of water sitting at 120 degrees, whether you're home to use it or not, whether it's July or January, whether anyone in the house will touch that water for another 6 hours or not. The average American household spends somewhere between $450 and $600 a year just heating water. Not the whole electric bill, not the whole gas bill. One appliance, sitting quietly in a corner of your basement, running a tab you never agreed to sign. In Elkhart County, Indiana, there is a farmhouse that does not own a water heater. Not a tankless one. Not a heat pump model. None at all. What comes out of the kitchen tap in that house in the middle of February is warm enough to wash dishes in without a second thought, and it gets that way using a coil of copper pipe, a wooden box, a pane of old storm window glass, and the sun sitting low over a soybean field. Total cost to build it, using scrap the family already had lying in a pole barn, $45. By the end of this video, I am going to walk you through exactly how that box is built, the pipe, the angle, the glazing, the plumbing, and I'm going to show you one modification, something I found sitting almost unnoticed inside a Department of Energy field survey from 1978 that almost nobody building these boxes online ever mentions. It's the difference between a system that gives you lukewarm water on a good day and one that gives you genuinely hot water even after a string of cloudy ones and survives its first hard freeze without cracking a single joint. I want to be honest with you before we go any further. I did not always believe any of this. For years, I looked at solar water heating exactly the way most people do. A hobby for retired engineers with too much free time, not a serious replacement for an appliance that already works fine. I had a business degree. My own father spent 30 years as a mechanical engineer. I had a tankless gas unit installed in my own house because a contractor told me, with total confidence, that it was the smart, modern upgrade. I paid for it. I told my neighbors about it. I never once sat down and worked out what it actually cost me year after year compared to heating water for close to nothing. That changed on a July afternoon 3 years ago, sitting at a kitchen table across from a farmer named Samuel Byler, watching his wife fill a kettle straight from the tap and set it on the stove without pre-boiling it first, because it was already hot. Not warm. Hot. I asked her how. She pointed out the window at what I'd assumed, walking up the driveway 20 minutes earlier, was just a cold frame for starting seedlings in spring. It wasn't. It was the collector box. Samuel told me his grandfather built the first version of that box in the late 1970s, right around the time the oil embargo had every utility company and every homeowner in the country scrambling, and the federal government was, for a few short years, actually funding serious research into exactly this kind of simple solar thermal collector. The Solar Energy Research Institute, which eventually folded into what is now the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, published field data in 1978 and again in 1979 on flat plate collectors built from little more than black painted metal and a sheet of glazing, showing that a box no larger than a card table could raise incoming water temperature by 60 to 80 degrees on a clear day using nothing but copper, glass, and correct orientation toward the sun. Sandia National Laboratories ran parallel field testing through 1980, confirming the numbers independently. Then oil prices dropped. The residential solar tax credits from the Energy Tax Act of 1978 expired in the mid-1980s, and almost the entire body of that research got quietly shelved. Not because it stopped working, because nobody needed it to work anymore, commercially, and knowledge nobody is being paid to keep alive tends to go quiet fast. Samuel's family never got that memo, mostly because nobody was ever trying to sell them anything to begin with. They just kept building the box, generation after generation, the same way you'd keep sharpening a good knife. Here is what's actually inside it. The collector itself is a length of 1/2 inch or 3/4 inch copper pipe, bent back and forth into a flat serpentine coil. Picture a copper ribbon folded into a zigzag roughly 2 feet by 3 feet. Copper specifically, not PEX, and not the black plastic tubing you'll see recommended in a lot of shortcut versions floating around online, because copper conducts heat roughly 20 times faster than plastic, and won't degrade under constant direct UV exposure the way plastic tubing will within a single season or two outdoors. You can scavenge this length of pipe from old refrigeration lines, plumbing offcuts from a renovation job, or simply buy a single 20-foot roll for somewhere around $18 to $22 at a hardware store. That coil sits inside a shallow wooden box. Plywood or reclaimed fence board works perfectly fine. This doesn't need to be furniture grade. Lined on the inside with sheet aluminum, or, in Samuel's family's case, flattened tin cans hammered smooth with the labels burned off in a fire barrel. Everything inside that box, the wood and the pipe both, gets painted matte black. Not glossy black, matte. Gloss reflects away a meaningful portion of the light that hits it. Matte black absorbs almost all of it and converts it directly into heat. This isn't folk wisdom, it's basic black-body radiation physics, and it's the entire reason this box works at all, instead of just sitting there. The box then gets a lid of glass or clear polycarbonate, sealed reasonably tight, sitting an inch or two above the coil rather than resting directly on it. That air gap does something very specific. It traps the heat radiating up off the black-painted copper the same way a closed car window traps heat on a hot afternoon, creating a small greenhouse effect that stops the wind from stripping the warmth away faster than the sun can add it. Old storm windows, the kind sitting forgotten in half the garages in this country, work perfectly for this and cost nothing if you already have a few. The whole assembly then gets tilted, and this detail matters more than most tutorials online ever mention, at an angle roughly equal to your local latitude, plus about 15 degrees on top of that if you specifically want stronger winter performance, since the sun sits much lower in the sky in January and you want that black surface facing it as directly as possible, rather than facing more toward summer sun overhead. In most of the continental United States, that lands you somewhere between 45 and 55 degrees of tilt, facing due south, no more than about 10 degrees off true south if you can help it. Cold water feeds in at the bottom of the coil straight from your existing supply line, gets pushed upward through the zigzag using nothing but your home's ordinary water pressure, and comes out the top of the box noticeably hotter. On a clear summer day, Samuel's family sees water coming off that coil somewhere between 140 and 160 degrees. On an overcast winter afternoon, more like 90 to 100. I want to be straight with you. That's not enough on its own to skip a backup heater entirely in the dead of a Minnesota January. This is not a total off-grid miracle in every climate, every month of the year, and anyone who tells you otherwise is lying to you to get a click. But it's enough to massively cut the amount of energy your existing heater has to add on top. Because a tank starting from a 100-degree baseline instead of a 55-degree baseline is doing a fraction of the work it normally does, every single day all year long. That preheated water then runs into a small insulated holding tank. An old electric water heater with the heating element pulled out works perfectly, wrapped afterward in a fiberglass insulating blanket you can pick up for about $15, before it ever reaches your main heater. Your existing system becomes a top-off appliance instead of the whole job, and that alone is where the real savings come from. A few details make a bigger difference here than people expect. The joints where copper meets copper should be soldered, not just pushed together with compression fittings, because compression fittings on a system that goes through daily heating and cooling cycles will work themselves loose within a season or two, and a leak inside a sealed glazed box is a slow, invisible problem until the wood underneath it starts to rot. Samuel's family resolders their joints roughly once every 8 to 10 years as routine maintenance, which is a fraction of the maintenance a conventional tank ever asks of you. The glazing on top should sit with a slight downward slope rather than perfectly flat, so that any overnight condensation runs off to one side instead of pooling and slowly clouding the glass, which would quietly reduce how much light reaches the coil without you ever noticing why your water started arriving a little cooler than it used to. Placement matters almost as much as construction. The box needs a minimum of 4 to 6 hours of direct, unobstructed sun, which rules out a heavily shaded backyard, but rarely rules out an entire property. A south-facing patio, the top of a low outbuilding roof, or a simple ground-mounted frame angled up off a flat yard, all work fine. Samuel's box sits on cinder blocks out in open pasture, 20 feet from the house, connected by insulated supply lines buried a few inches under the soil to prevent heat loss on the walk between the collector and the holding tank. For a suburban lot, that same run of pipe can simply travel along an exterior wall wrapped in foam pipe insulation, which costs only a few dollars a length and takes an afternoon to install. That's the base build. Here's the rehook, because I know exactly what some of you watching this are already thinking. I rent. I have an HOA that would fight me on this. I don't have a south-facing wall or roof to work with. Stay with me, because this next part is specifically for you. This exact box works perfectly well as a freestanding unit sitting on a patio, a balcony, or propped against a fence, plumbed with simple garden hose-style quick connects instead of hard plumbed into your house lines. You fill a bucket straight from the hot output and use it for dishes, laundry pre-soak, or a wash basin. No permit required for a wooden box sitting on your own patio. Now let's talk honestly about why almost nobody standing behind a hardware store counter will ever mention any of this to you. I am not going to sell you a story about executives sitting in a boardroom deciding to bury solar water heating on purpose. Nobody needed to conspire to make that happen. Here's what actually took place. Once the tax credits created under the Energy Tax Act of 1978 expired in the mid-1980s, the economics for manufacturers building pre-assembled solar water heating systems collapsed almost overnight. Building code offices, which had briefly written provisions specifically for solar thermal installations during that late 70s window, simply stopped updating them once demand dried up. Plumbing supply chains reorganized around gas and electric tank units, because that's what contractors were installing every single day, and that's what apprentices were being trained on in trade schools. Nobody sat down and made a decision to erase this knowledge from the country. The market simply stopped paying anyone to keep it alive, and information that nobody is being paid to remember has a way of going quiet within a generation. I'm not going to tell you what conclusion to draw from that. I'm just going to lay two facts side by side. This technology worked, and was proven to work, in federally funded field testing back in 1978. And more than 40 years later, most licensed plumbers in this country have never installed one, and most hardware stores don't stock a single component of a kit for it. You can sit with those two facts however you'd like. What's strange is that the underlying parts never went anywhere. Copper pipe is still sold on every hardware store shelf in the country. Glass is still glass. The physics didn't get harder or more expensive between 1978 and today. If anything, copper is more affordable relative to income now than it was during the embargo years that first inspired this design. The only thing that actually changed is that nobody in the supply chain has a reason to explain any of it to you at the counter, because there's no pre-built product to sell you off that same shelf. Here's the piece I promised you at the beginning. The buried modification. Nearly every version of this build you'll come across online covers daytime operation and stops right there. What Samuel's family does differently, something I found referenced almost in passing inside that same 1978 field report under the heading Nighttime Thermosyphon Loss, is a simple gravity drain valve installed at the very lowest point of the collector loop. At night, or ahead of a hard freeze, you open that valve for about 30 seconds, and the water drains itself completely out of the exposed copper coil, back into the insulated holding tank using nothing but gravity. No pump, no electricity, no moving parts to fail. That single $4 valve is the entire difference between a system that cracks its copper coil on the very first freezing night of the season and one that runs quietly for 15 years without a single burst joint. I have never once seen a tutorial online